Well, you're in for a treat today. I'm so excited that Pauline Brand Nelson will be speaking to us out of her own life. She was born in Vellore, South India, where her parents, Dr. Paul and Dr. Margaret Brand, began their pioneering work. And this was really pioneering work in the treatment of leprosy. She moved with her family to London and later to Louisiana, where she grew up in the grounds of the last remaining leprosy hospital in the continental USA. She was educated at Wheaton College. She just said USA, but I know where you went, Pauline. And the UK, she's worked in television studios for the BBC, in the offices of a small-town newspaper, and public health research unit at the University of Leeds. She lives in Santa Barbara, works as a librarian and a writer-editor. She's married to a philosopher, Dr. Mark Nelson. And she has 3 almost grown daughters and a dachshund. And she is passionate about good writing, healthy food, and sharing the legacy of her parents' work. Pauline, I'm so glad you're with us today. Let's give her a Westmont welcome.
Thank you. Well, I am so grateful for the invitation to tell you about the work of my parents. Later this month is the first anniversary of my mother's death, so for me it's just great to have the chance to speak of her. You might get something out of it too, since what I'll be talking about fits into the conversation about global focus and finding our calling. Plus, I'll be throwing in some science education, so some of you could ask for extra credit. That's how it works, right? I am the youngest of 6 children, so it might surprise you, as it surprised me, to learn that my mother once decided she should never be allowed to have children or care for them at all. She was 11 at the time and had reached this conclusion after almost dropping a 9-month-old baby off the side of a ship, moments after being left in charge of him. She caught his shirt as he fell and managed to pull him back to safety, and no one saw. I should add, she really wasn't to blame. The baby's mother had told her to take him to the side of the ship because he really loved to watch the waves. Margaret had never been around babies and had no idea how suddenly and vigorously a small child could lunge toward something he really loved. What I found the most shocking about this story was that I had never heard it, not until I was an adult. It certainly hadn't made it into the book about my dad's work, a biography which was my usual source for all the family stories that I'd missed by coming last. And before you all rush out to buy a copy of 10 Fingers for God, you should know it contains very few references to me. That story wasn't in the book because Margaret hadn't told the author or anyone about it for years, out of shame. Although, as I pointed out, she was only a child herself at the time, obeying the supposed expert, and hello, she caught the baby. She told me she spent the rest of that day on her cabin bed, trembling with a fresh understanding of her own life in light of this nearly catastrophic event. In the future, as she now saw it, she must have nothing to do with children, ever, and she made that a solemn resolve. Why am I telling you this? Because she was so wrong, luckily for me. And as you'll hear, it wasn't the only time that she or my father would be convinced that they were unsuited for the work that they finally accomplished. So to any of you who have very firm ideas about what you can and can't do in the years to come, I just want to suggest you take a lesson from the baby on the ship story. Don't be too quick to rule out possibilities for your future. And obviously the other lesson, hold babies very carefully. Okay, so on with the main story. Paul Brand and Margaret Berry were met as medical students in London. Sharing the first letter of their last names, they were assigned the same chem lab bench, a fact that led me to think for years that a chem lab bench was the best place to meet the love of your life. Their first social outing revealed the difference in their backgrounds. Dad had been raised in a missionary home. Mum's was all medical. So when he invited her to go with him to a PM, she thought, post-mortem? But she didn't say anything. Maybe this was what medical school dating was like, until they got to the church and the prayer meeting. After qualifying as doctors, they married and started a family while Hitler was bombing London to pieces. Then, in 1947, they accepted an invitation to join a newly established Christian medical school in South India. Paul would teach surgery, Margaret would work wherever in the hospital she was needed, and have more children. After settling in at the medical school, Paul visited a friend who worked at a local clinic just for leprosy patients. These patients wouldn't be allowed anywhere near the main hospital or anywhere in society because leprosy was thought to be highly contagious. At that time, breakthrough drug therapy to halt leprosy's progress in a patient was showing great promise. But surgery to correct damage already done, to restore function to paralyzed hands, that was virtually unheard of. No one knew whether affected tissue would even heal after surgery. And by the time a patient's hand had developed the distinctive clawed paralysis, looked a bit like this, that everyone recognized as leprosy, people thought that the muscles were useless. And yet, as my father and his friend walked around the clinic, his professional curiosity was piqued, and he stopped to examine one young man's hands, holding them in his own. This action was, on the face of it, inexplicable. Paul had encountered leprosy only once before as a boy, living with his missionary parents in the South Indian hills, and the memory of that encounter had long haunted him. He recalled the terror on his mother's face and his own panic at the thought of contact with whatever had so disfigured the men crouching outside the house, men who had come many miles in search of the kindness of the Christians they had heard about. In the years to come, Paul himself would lead the call for an end to the cruel isolation of leprosy's victims. Research would show that most people are naturally immune to the disease, and that with treatment, patients become non-contagious. But over the centuries, caregivers in this field have sometimes shared the fate of the people they served. And that day, when Paul took the young man's hands in his own, he did so with a sense of being vulnerable to danger. But the man he was simply couldn't have done anything else. It was an instinctive move, reflecting two changes that had taken place between his first encounter with leprosy as a child and his second as a young surgeon. He'd gained excellent medical training, and he'd committed himself fully to the service of Christ. Manipulating the man's fingers, Paul noted the lack of any useful movement, such as the finger-to-thumb pinch. Then, interested to test any remnant of muscle strength, Paul asked the man to squeeze his hand as hard as he possibly could and waited to feel some flutter of movement. Instead, his hand was gripped so powerfully he cried out in pain. It was the moment that changed my father's life. In that split second of acute discomfort, he was given the kind of clarity we all hope for. The direction of his life's work came into focus. He went on to develop surgical techniques to harness that hidden strength, using tendon transplants to restore useful movement to countless pairs of hands. It's ironic that the signal guiding my father into that life was a jolt of pain, because his research came to show that it is the loss of sensation, of pain itself, which is the key to most of the damage one sees in leprosy. Without pain's warning signal, only diligent attention prevents injury and infection. Long before I understood the physiology behind this, I was familiar with the phrase, "Thank God for pain," because it was Dad's refrain when any of us children got hurt, which out there in the wilds of India happened a lot. I'd be sobbing over a scraped knee, and my father would explain with passionate enthusiasm what a beautiful job my perfect nerves were doing, and how platelets and who knows what all else were rushing to stop the bleeding. I wasn't always quite as thrilled as he was, but his message got through. So that was Paul's start. What about Margaret? Well, as for many women who combined career and children, her path was more complicated. Even her decision to come to India had been tougher than Paul's. He had gone ahead to explore the possibilities and started sending back enthusiastic telegrams saying, "It's great, bring the kids and come on the next ship." But this was all around the time of Indian independence, and the partition of Muslim and Hindu territories had triggered terrible violence and massacres. Back in London, Margaret was seeing newspaper headlines like, "India is a bloodbath." Bring her toddler and newborn to that? Torn by indecision, she arranged a day of prayer with friends for guidance. On that morning, she knelt with them, and almost immediately, she stood up again and told her friends that it was all right. They could go home. She had had the assurance immediately given that she needed, and she was going to India. This was classic Margaret, a worrier by nature. When God's direction was clear to her, fearless. Too bad for everybody who'd been looking forward to that PM. In India, far to the south of the violence, she jumped into a busy schedule at the hospital, occasionally interrupted when word reached her of naughty things her children were getting up to. Not me, obviously. As you'd know if you read the book, all the interesting stuff happened before I was born. And even when I did come along, family movies will indicate I was fully occupied making mud pies. Margaret steered firmly clear of only one medical specialty, ophthalmology, having not done that rotation in med school. But one Friday, the chief of staff stopped her in the hallway to say there was a desperate need for a doctor in the eye clinic. Her heart sank. "I don't know the first thing about eyes," she said. "You'll learn," was the response. "Start Monday." Well, in the catalogue of life callings, I would say this is your basic no-frills model. But again, Margaret stepped up. Before long, she was heading out to villages to perform up to 100 cataract removals in a single day in the back of a hospital van. Later, she started an eye clinic at the newly built leprosy hospital, where Paul was now often working. Now remember, leprosy affects the nerves, and nowhere on the body is more vulnerable to a loss of sensation than the eyes. Without sensation, there is no blink reflex. And without a regular blink, eyes are in dire peril. But it's impossible to blink intentionally all day long. So blindness was a common outcome. Margaret took on that challenge, and she was for years the world expert in ocular leprosy. Paul's work especially attracted worldwide attention, even earned him the CBE medal, which stands for Commander of the British Empire. So they were presented to the Queen when she visited India. Having no money, they had to borrow some proper clothes. In fact, on the way there, Margaret was still hemming up the borrowed pants Paul was going to wear while he drove. I don't know what he was wearing at the time. She had borrowed some lovely shoes. Who cares if they're too big, right? So the Queen comes down the line and Margaret starts into the obligatory deep curtsy that she's been practicing, and a bit of a wobble sets in. Everyone knows the protocol. You just touch the tips of the Queen's fingers as you curtsy, and no more. But Margaret feels herself falling. And the same lightning reflexes that helped her catch a baby falling off a ship kick right in. She grabs the Queen's arm and holds herself up, hand over hand. I love that story. So that was how the main work of their lives began. Dad's curiosity was awakened by a jolt of pain. Mum was told exactly where her help was needed. I think of what Frederick Buechner said in his book, Wishful Thinking. God is calling you to the place where your deep joy meets the world's deep hunger. I think Dad might have been paying more attention to the deep joy and Mum more to the world's hunger, but they got to the same place because both of them were paying attention. Fast forward to my teenage years. By now, we were living in the US on the grounds of, as Ben said, the only leprosarium in the continental US. I bet you didn't even know before today that there was one, in Carville, Louisiana. Like the families of all the hospital staff, we lived behind the high chain-link fence that surrounded it. A fence erected in the days before the disease was fully understood. A fence to keep patients from escaping. Growing up behind that marker of separation had a profound effect on me. I used to watch the cars that sometimes cruised slowly by on the outside of the fence, people inside craning to see the lepers, and I felt sick. By the way, the term leper is no longer okay to use when you're talking about someone with leprosy, since that word has come to acquire its own definition as outcast or pariah. By college age, I'd read that book, 10 Fingers for God, a couple of times, folded down the corners of the approximately 3 pages in which I was mentioned, and I was having a bad case of big shoes to fill. I knew what a calling looked like, and I was waiting for mine. I liked the idea of medicine. I loved hanging around at my mother's eye clinic and examining eyes, but I loved a lot of other things as well. So I started college pre-med, and here is the template I'm pretty sure I was working with. Be a brilliant doctor, marry another brilliant doctor, whom I would meet in chem lab naturally, find some disease that hadn't been properly sorted out yet, and sort it out. Possibly get an honor from the Queen? There were 2 problems with that plan. Actually, way more than 2, but for now I'll just focus on the 2. The first was that I saw my parents' lives as this beautiful, smooth trajectory. Yes, there was hardship, but look how well everything fit together. And the second was, I thought I could replicate it. Well, of course it looked like a smooth trajectory. I was reading a carefully crafted biography. And yes, I occasionally skipped over some stuff, like all the moments of uncertainty and doubt, and that whole bit where the young Paul said he would never be a doctor and decided to go into the building trade instead. I always skimmed over that. But he didn't skim it. He worked as a builder for 5 years, learning bricklaying and stonemasonry, before taking a brief course of field medicine for prospective missionaries, which awoke his scientific curiosity, and he agreed at last to go to medical school, 5 years older than the rest of his classmates. That's a pretty long detour for a supposedly smooth trajectory. For Paul and Margaret, moving forward through life felt like it does for the rest of us, like driving in the dark, when you're only able to see as far ahead as the headlights are showing. Only their habit of daily committing their path to Christ kept them going with courage. And only in the rear-view mirror did they see how it all came together. In fact, Dad always said those 5 years spent in the building trade taught him many principles that were key to his understanding of biomechanics. Time spent equipping yourself with a good education and skills is rarely wasted, people. I'm just throwing that out. As for my notion of replicating their life, well, that fizzled out when I failed OChem in sophomore year. But it wouldn't have worked anyway. God is calling you to where your deep joy meets the world's deep hunger. It's that connecting point of two utterly unique things: your own deep joy and the world where you are, the needs of your unique time and place. So I couldn't follow the exact call to service that my parents had heard and followed, but I could imitate qualities I saw in them, aspects of their beautiful natures. These, I came to understand, had been cultivated in turn by imitating Christ. And I'd like to close by telling you about the clearest examples of them doing that. It wasn't, as I thought once, that they followed Christ's example as a healer, even as a healer of people with leprosy. No, it had more to do with the greater healing that Christ accomplished by coming physically to be with us, the human race. Emmanuel, on our side of the fence. Vulnerable to the full contagion of mankind, suffering, betrayal, rejection, and loneliness. A life lived alongside leprosy taught me a lot about the destructive power of isolation, the way in which it intensifies all other suffering. One little story offers an example. In the early trials of his new surgery, Paul was examining the hand of a possible candidate. The man also had some facial damage, which surgery would not repair. "But it's not so bad," said Paul, resting a hand on his shoulder and trying for a little joke, something about men not having to worry so much about having beautiful faces. And he was dismayed when the man started to sob and asked the translator what was wrong. She asked the man and relayed the answer. "It is because you put your hand on his shoulder," she said. "No one has touched him for years." My parents fought back against the terrible effects of that isolation, and not even mainly, with their medical skill. I remember my father crouching to examine an ulcerous foot, not with distaste, but with beaming admiration, and giving the same enthusiastic description of how that patient's amazing body was busy with its healing work, as he would give us children, as he would give anyone. I remember my mother greeting each patient in the line that stretched out the door of her clinic, patients who really didn't need an appointment that day, but who came because she embraced them. She knew the punchlines to their jokes. She laughed and cried with them. People who were used to being treated as outcasts were reminded by my parents of who they really were. By paying kind, lively, complete attention to the life right in front of them, they were saying the same things that Christ came to tell us all. I'm with you. You are beloved. Before my parents died, I traveled back to India once with them, and I experienced the power of such loving attention in a way that's sometimes hard for me to describe. We were flying through the night from Delhi to Chennai in an elderly plane that did not inspire confidence in this phobic flyer. My parents were sweetly asleep, Mum's head nodding over the pages of her Bible. Then we hit terrible turbulence. Now, I was a grown woman, so there was obviously no reason for me to wake my frail and elderly mother, who couldn't do anything anyway. On the other hand, the plane was pitching and I was terrified, and my children were about to be motherless, and she was my mum, and so I woke her up. She took my hands in hers and prayed. Not that we wouldn't crash, I should point out, but that we would feel God's presence. And I remember in my fear wanting to clarify to God that I didn't want to literally be in his presence just then. Then, still holding my hands, she smiled sleepily at me, her eyes so bleary in the dim light I wasn't sure she knew it was me. And she said, "You are precious." Now, she said that kind of thing to me and others all the time. But I tell you, in that moment, I felt the truth of those words, like an electric shock. Maybe she did think I was a stranger in the seat next to her. I don't know. Maybe that's why this didn't feel like a mother-daughter moment. It felt like a human moment, and God was right there. My deep hunger met her deep joy, I think. I looked at her old hands holding mine, the same hands that decades before had moved in a split second to catch a baby falling towards the ocean. Since then, how many other lives had she caught, held on to, brought courage to? Fixing people's eyes and feet and hands may have been my parents' life calling, but reminding people of their value and the great good that was in them, standing with them in a low, lonely moment, that was their daily calling. And it can be mine, and yours too, whatever you end up doing for a living. You may never meet a person with leprosy. You probably wouldn't know if you did, as the disease is so well controlled now. In fact, the only countries where it is endemic are those where the stigma is still so great people don't come forward for treatment. But wherever in the world your extraordinary life may take you, or maybe even here on campus, you will encounter the suffering that comes from isolation. People fenced in by illness, fear, poverty, loneliness. You may be equipped to help. That could be the life's work that you are educating yourself for. Or you may feel that you've been handed a baby for the first time in your life and you don't know what to do. And if that's the case, here's a tip. Don't take them over to the side of the ship. Just take their hands and be there. Turn off your phone and listen to their story. Let your presence tell them the truth, that they are not alone, that they are beloved. And if you like, you could also tell them what my mum would tell them, and what she would tell each of you if she were here, and what I will tell you, because it is my deep joy to do so, that you, every one of you, is precious. Thank you.